Over the past few decades, we've seen a huge change in the way Hollywood turns out movies. The focus seems to have shifted from original content to franchises and movie series. And even though there are many people who claim they are absolutely sick and tired of major franchises trying to milk every last penny from them, they still manage to make lots of money, one way or another. But why are franchises so prevalent in the industry? In this video, we talk about why franchises took over Hollywood and what the future is starting to look like. We have a lot to talk about, so let's dive into it. In typical video essay style, we have to be clear what we mean when we say movie franchise, but we can't do that without talking about what movies are first. And we can't talk about movies without talking about humans and what we think humans are. Okay, I'm obviously kidding, but we do need to be clear what we mean when we say movie franchise. Movie franchises are just series of connected films. They don't have to be one huge interconnected cinematic universe to qualify as a franchise. Just keep in mind that they're not standalone films. They're a series of movies that are connected by some common theme, characters, or story. Think Harry Potter, Marvel Cinematic Universe, James Bond, Star Wars, The Hunger Games, the list goes on and on. And franchises aren't anything new. Sure, in recent decades, we've seen more and more franchises taking center stage, but they've existed for a very long time in Hollywood. It just took a little bit of time for the film industry to really understand how to make them in a way that would lead to major financial success. In the past, we already had franchises such as Universal Classic Monsters dating all the way back to 1931 with the film Dracula. We also had film series such as James Bond that date back to 1961 with Dr. No that, despite regularly switching up the actor that would play the main character, it continued to get new entries and grew into the massive franchise we know today. Or take for example the Carry On franchise dating back to 1958. It's a British comedy franchise that expanded past its 31 core films to have a few Christmas specials, TV series, and even a stage show. These are just a few examples of franchises that already existed in the past, but they all existed during a time where Hollywood was still a bit iffy on the idea and during a time that they weren't yet the star of the show. Sure, we'd get a few popping up here and there, but Hollywood didn't consider them to be massive moneymakers, and that's because they didn't really know how to use them properly. Most of the time, when a successful movie got a sequel, it would go on to earn less money at the box office than the original. But starting in the 70s, this way of thinking began to shift, and it really started with The Godfather Part 2, which was the first sequel to ever win Best Picture at the Academy Awards. And once you get an Academy Award for something, well, now we know it's gonna get taken seriously. During the 80s and 90s, we got a much clearer trend for sequels, especially when it came to action films. Star Wars, Terminator, Die Hard, Back to the Future, Ghostbusters, Indiana Jones, Lethal Weapon, and so many more film series were popping up that they really began taking a grasp on the film industry. But before we talk about the benefits of franchises and why they began to take over, there is one thing that I want to call out. If you look at all the films being made today, we're not actually seeing many more that are sequels or related to franchises. They just feel like they're everywhere because that seems to be the main focus for theaters and movie marketing in general. Studios are pushing these films harder than ever because that's where the money is. And that's the part I want to focus on. We're still getting a ton of original films in theaters and on all the different streaming platforms, which has mostly replaced direct-to-DVD movies, but in theaters, there seems to be a much larger focus on franchise films. And it's also where audiences seem to be spending most of their money. For example, in 1988, of the top 10 grossing films released that year, only one of them was a sequel, Crocodile Dundee 2. Fast forward to 2014, 7 of the top 10 grossing films were sequels. Then in 2018, 9 of the top 10 highest grossing films were part of a major franchise. Bohemian Rhapsody was the only one that wasn't. In 2022, all 10 of the highest grossing films were sequels or part of some well-known franchise. So why is there such a huge focus put on these franchises? Why have they seemingly taken over theaters and the box office? There are a lot of reasons for this, some that you might not have expected. The obvious part though is that no matter how you slice it or dice it, just as with most things related to Hollywood, it all comes down to money and how they can make as much as possible. There's a paper from the University of Reading titled, "Why Are There So Many Movie Sequels?" that goes into more details about this exact topic, and in that paper they outlined how since the year 2000, new movies that are part of a familiar franchise have been consistently more profitable than other releases. And that's also around the time franchises really began to take over theaters. Franchises are a great way to earn money as risk-free as possible for a variety of reasons. Firstly, franchises offer familiarity. If a studio has a massively successful film or franchise, they already have an audience awareness built in for the next installment of it. There is less risk that people won't go to see it, and the marketing can revolve more around awareness that a sequel is coming instead of trying to convince people to come and see it. And that is much easier. We like familiarity, especially when it comes to things that we spend money on. Going to theaters to see the same stars, characters, and stories allows us to know what we're getting into. And if we know we liked a previous film from the same franchise, then we'll probably like the new one. And movie franchises that are built on a pre-existing IP that already has a massive fan base, such as Harry Potter or Marvel or DC, are almost a no-brainer when it comes to making movies. The intellectual property comes with a built-in brand awareness. The loyal fans of a specific IP will most likely go and watch the movie without really needing convincing. And on top of that, oftentimes franchises have massive potential for a secondary stream of income from merchandise. It's tough making an original film that can move merchandise, but franchises make massive amounts of money from the merch sales. And I'm including video games in this category as well. Just think about the number of Star Wars, Marvel, DC, and Harry Potter video games, Lego sets, toys, etc., that exist out there. It's all a cycle that locks people into being loyal fans of a franchise and keeps them spending money. Don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with that. I love Star Wars and a bunch of other film franchises that I will watch and buy merchandise from. But I'm also feeling burnt out with all the stuff that we're getting lately. It's hard to keep up. Before we move on to the next section, if you like this video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. Also, for this video, I want everyone to leave a comment recommending a movie to watch that isn't part of the usual films in a massive franchise. A movie that you really like and think deserves more awareness. Anyways, let's keep going. After everything I've just said, you may be asking yourself, if franchises and sequels are such big moneymakers and provide a fairly risk-free way of making that money, why weren't they adopted earlier? Why was it that in the past, sequels would be subject to diminishing returns? So something must have changed. And the biggest thing that changed was the way we watch movies. Before the huge franchise boom, the main way we would see movies was in theaters. That was also the main way we would discover movies that we like. Hollywood was on a constant search for films that would perform very well at the box office. There was an understanding that most of the films made would lose money or just manage to make it back. But the films that were hits would make such huge amounts of money that it would keep studios raking it in. People went to theaters to discover new things they would like. In the past, franchises weren't as huge, but we did have very specific genres that Hollywood roughly knew would perform well. So similar to the franchise of today, they would try to make as many of those as possible. Think the Western as the perfect example of this. Audiences didn't have an easy, on-demand way to consume movies at home, so money was made mostly in the theaters. But then came VHS, which would later evolve into DVD and then Blu-ray. Independent of what the medium was, we could now watch movies at home. And instead of paying movie ticket prices to discover new films, we could just rent or buy or borrow films for cheaper than it would cost to go to the theaters as a group or a family. And this changed the way we discover what we like. If you really liked certain films, you'd probably go on to buy the physical copy once it left theaters. And if you heard that a movie was good, you could just wait until it left theaters and get it on VHS. So audiences began preferring going to theaters for the must-see in theater experiences or films that they kind of knew they would enjoy versus risking it with something new. If you really liked the first Back to the Future, you'll probably enjoy the second one. Same goes for any other series of films. Humans like to be comfortable, especially when it comes to spending money. Why spend money on something that I might not enjoy if I could lower the risk on my end? And ticket prices were getting more expensive as well, which added fuel to the fire. Combine this with the birth and rise of the blockbuster in the late 70s and 80s, which were often those must-see theater experiences that also gave people FOMO for not watching them, especially when everyone around you already has, and there went your movie ticket money for the month. And despite what I just said, at-home physical media wasn't a bad thing for Hollywood. It was actually a huge blessing. Because as we know, Hollywood likes to reduce risk. The truth is, no one knows what will be a hit at the box office, but having a secondary income stream from physical media allowed Hollywood to take more risks because of two reasons. For one, if a movie didn't make its money back at the box office, it could still make some of it back, maybe even more in the post-theater physical media run. Some movies would go on to become bigger hits after they left theaters. The other reason was that having this secondary stream of income helped fund some of these more experimental films, which were usually originals. And those originals would sometimes really pay off, so having this insurance in the form of physical media allowed Hollywood to be a bit more risky with the types of films they made. But it wasn't the only thing that pushed franchises into being the main thing we see in theaters today. The next big shift in how we consume movies was the tipping point, and I'm talking about streaming. We've talked a lot about streaming on this channel before, and as we make more and more videos that touch on the topic, I'm becoming more and more comfortable saying that streaming had a big negative impact on the film industry. Sure, there are a lot of positives like being able to consume content on demand for still pretty cheap, even though it's getting more and more expensive, but it has had a lot of adverse effects on Hollywood and us, the audiences. When streaming entered the picture, physical media sales took a massive hit, which cut out a huge part of what films could be earning in total. Just a few examples. Take a movie like Shrek 2. Shrek 2 made about $935 million at the box office and then another $348 million from physical sales. Or Finding Nemo. It made $940 million at the box office and then went on to make another $801 million from video sales. It's the best-selling DVD of all time and it almost doubled its box office earnings after it left theaters. Compare that to a film like Avengers Endgame, which was a huge success, making almost $2.8 billion at the box office. I'm sure no one's complaining, but it made a relatively small amount from physical sales, bringing in only an extra $107 million. Yes, I know that a lot of these films are being used to propel the streaming services forward, but as we know, that business model hasn't been as lucrative as we originally thought. And also, the examples I just gave are pretty extreme because the films were obviously profitable at the box office. But when you start to look at films that earned less at the box office, films like The Nice Guys, which was an amazing film but didn't really shine when you look at the financials, the story becomes a bit clearer. It had a budget of $50 million and went on to make $59.5 million at the box office and then only an additional $6.4 million in video sales. When using the 2.5x rule, the film lost money, which is disappointing. So what does the future look like? Lately, there seems to have been a shift in mindset. Pretty much after Avengers Endgame, we started to see more and more people expressing disgruntled opinions on the sheer amount of content being released for certain franchises. These days, it feels like every week we're hearing about some new Marvel-related movie or TV show or video game that's coming out. The same goes for Star Wars. Studios earned a lot of money from franchises and really leaned into them being the way to move forward. And Disney is a huge part of this overall franchise fatigue. Streaming really cut into the money-making abilities of studios, and now we're starting to see people get a bit tired of these franchises and cinematic universes, as well as all the remakes that we're getting. It feels like there is a lack of original films, and when we do get original films, it almost feels like they're reserved for the movie lovers instead of the general public. There are a lot of original films out there that don't get the attention they deserve. So please, I'm begging you, next time you want to go to theaters, don't just pick the next Marvel movie or biggest franchise film. Take a look at what's out there and what people are saying is good, and you might find something you like. Go on Metacritic, Rotten Tomatoes, or my favorite, Letterboxd, and see what films are in theaters that people really like. Yes, there is always a risk that you won't like what you saw and that you'll feel like you wasted money, but trust me, you will eventually find a gem. A film that you absolutely love and want everyone to see instead of the usual formulaic ones. So it got a little bit preachy at the end, but thanks for watching. Let's make this video's comment section another place for people to find films that they wouldn't have otherwise seen. We're always looking for new films to watch here at FilmStack, so we'll also be in the comments looking for that next gem. If you like this video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. Also, check out our Patreon for some cool perks. And until next time, have a good one.